Hey everybody, Professor Jeff here, and we are back with Book 2 of Plato's Republic. I will remind you from the last time, we have a few different characters having a little discussion about some of life's most difficult questions, like what happens when we get older, does money actually help us, and whether or not it's actually useful to us to be good people in life. So I'll remind you, we have a few different characters in our dialogue so far. These are Thrasymachus, who was a sophist, and remind you that these were Socrates' intellectual adversaries back in ancient Greece. There are also Glaucon and Adeimantus, who are Plato's actual brothers, and Polemarchus, who was another notable philosopher of the time, who had, along with Thrasymachus, invited Socrates, Plato, and his brothers to his home in order to have a discussion. And in Book 2, they will continue that discussion, talking about the different kinds of good things that exist, a specific allegory about justice that served as the inspiration for the Lord of the Rings, good and bad reputations, what kind of people should join the military, and how they should be raised, and some of Plato's less well-known ideas about censorship and his monotheistic tendencies. Stay tuned. So, the dialogue picks up in Polemarchus' home. The characters are in the middle of a discussion about justice, and Socrates questions the notion that was discussed in Book 1, that injustice leads to a better overall life, while being just leads to an objectively worse life. While he was able to rebut Thrasymachus' previous argument, the other philosophers aren't quite willing to let the discussion end. Remember, this is important, because for the ancient Greeks, logos was the act of discoursing or discussion to arrive at the fairest possible version of truth. And this conversation that they're participating in served as an investigation into the nature of the good life. This was a big change in the kind of philosophy that Socrates practiced. Prior to him, earlier philosophers, who are typically referred to as the pre-Socratics, functioned a lot more like proto-scientists, observing the world around them and theorizing about its structure and function. Some of those were like Thales, who was actually the first recorded philosopher in Western history. He posited that everything in the world was water. Now, this was something of a figurative statement. Some argue that it actually should be taken literally. It's neither here nor there. This branch of philosophy that the pre-Socratics, the proto-scientists, practiced is now understood as cosmology, or the study of the cosmos. Historians of philosophy, in part, even understand the distinction between the pre-Socratics and ancient Greek philosophy to involve Socrates' greater focus on practical human matters over cosmological investigation. To that end, these characters continued their methodology, despite some grievances that were raised about Socrates' argumentation style. So, while Thrasymachus had given up his argument that the unjust life bore greater rewards than the just life, Glaucon is ready to pick it up. He tells Socrates that they are not fully convinced of his position that living justly is truly superior to living unjustly. He distinguishes three kinds of good things. The first are things that we like for their own sake, and not because of some desired effect from them. These are like appreciating a sunset or beautiful music. For our purposes here, because they will come up again, I will call these intrinsic goods. The good is intrinsic to the thing. We like the thing for itself. Second are things that are both enjoyable to participate in, like the intrinsic goods, but that also bring about a desirable effect. Glaucon lists thinking and being healthy among these things. I'll call these here total goods. Finally, there are what I'll call instrumental goods, or things that aren't enjoyable in and of themselves, but bring about a pleasant or necessary effect. The examples given in the Republic are exercise, receiving medical treatment, and working for money. So Socrates argues that justice is a total good, something that we would enjoy doing and that brings about a positive result. Glaucon argues that justice is actually of that third kind, an instrumental good that we practice not because it is good in itself, but brings about a positive result. What he believes it brings about is both a general state of peace socially and a good reputation for an individual. And in order to achieve these ends, he believes most people will endure what he calls the drudgery of being just. He argues specifically that performing injustice without reprisal is the best case. But suffering injustice without being able to avenge yourself is the worst case scenario. He then believes that citizens within a just society agree to act justly toward one another as a mean between these two possibilities. So being just is kind of like a chore that must be completed in order to get through each day as painlessly as possible. So these are the three kinds of goods that we'll return to in this discussion of justice and injustice throughout Book 2 here. What comes up next is Glaucon's continuation of his argument, and really one of the most interesting and influential allegories from the Republic. And, as I mentioned, this is actually an influence for J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. So, in order to make the argument that justice is an instrumental good, something we do for some other reason other than the enjoyment of it, Glaucon states that people act justly in order to achieve a good reputation. He believes that if someone were able to act unjustly and maintain a reputation for being just, then that is the best possible outcome for that person. While someone who is just, but has a reputation for being unjust, suffers the most. So if a supposedly just person were given the opportunity to act however they pleased without consequences, they would consistently choose injustice. He illustrates this with a story about a shepherd named Gyges, who, while tending to his flock, witnesses a thunderstorm and earthquake which opens a cavern in the ground. Approaching the cavern, Gyges finds a corpse that's described as slightly larger than an average human, and this corpse has a golden ring on its finger. He takes the ring off the corpse and discovers that when he turns it so that the jewel on the outside faces inward, he becomes invisible. With this newfound power, Glaucon supposes that Gyges would go on specifically to murder the king of the land and commit adultery with the queen. He concludes, and this is a quote directly from the text, "Men do not take justice to be a good for them in private, since wherever each supposes he can do injustice, he does it. Indeed, all men suppose injustice is far more to their private profit than justice." So this is, again, just a reiteration of the argument. Being unjust, being unfair, being a bad person is better for us individually if we can get away with it than being a good person. Why don't you let me know in the comments if you agree with this or not, or if you have any experience with this. Stories about this kind of thing can really help make the subject matter much clearer. And while you're at it, subscribe, leave a like, helps the video out. I'm not gonna lie, I do a lot of work here researching this stuff to put these summaries together for you, so support for the channel is excellent. Anyway, moving on. What Glaucon takes from this argument is that justice and injustice are socially valued insofar as they are able to grant someone a corresponding reputation. To illustrate this further, he takes two extreme hypotheticals, the perfectly just and the perfectly unjust man. of the perfectly unjust man, he says, again, another direct quote, let him also attempt unjust deeds correctly and get away with them. For the extreme of injustice is to seem to be just when one is not. He must be allowed to do the greatest injustices while having provided himself with the greatest reputation for justice. He contrasts this with the perfectly just man who doesn't act properly for the sake of appearing to do so, but simply because it is the right thing to do. Since if he acted in a noble manner for the reward of a good reputation, it would be unclear whether he's acting in this way for a reward or simply to be a good person. Glaucon adds to his description, another quote, doing no injustice, let him have the greatest reputation for injustice, so that his justice may be put to the test to see if it is softened by bad reputation and its consequences. He then asks Socrates to judge which of these two people will be happier and what kind of life each will lead. Glaucon claims the perfectly unjust person will be honored, achieve many accomplishments, and receive societal privileges, while the perfectly just person will be punished and have their station in life lowered. Further, he believes the gods will reward and punish them in similar fashions, as the gods, according to the ancient Greeks, can be swayed by public appeal and physical offerings. So, very much unlike monotheistic religions of the contemporary time, the gods don't really care if you're a good person or not. What they care about is how much honor you give them, what kinds of sacrifices you make for them. Those are the things they value. And if you do things they value, they will help you out. And if you do not, they will become spiteful and they will punish you. So, if you are living this perfectly unjust life that Glaucon describes, where you get over on people and do things unfairly and profit privately, you can then pass those earnings onto the gods and gain their favor as well. So given that there is no real punishment, according to Glaucon, for living a life of injustice, either in the social or divine realms, Glaucon makes an argument similar to one that we will see taken up by Nietzsche about 2,000 years later, which goes something like this. Many people choose a life of justice or morality due to a lack of daring. Their cowardice pushes them toward a meek existence, doing what they believe to be the right thing, when those who boldly choose to be unjust and smart enough to cover their tracks receive all the material and holy rewards. So Glaucon makes this challenge to Socrates. Show us, he says, show us, Socrates, that a life of justice is in fact good for what it brings and in itself as a total good, right? But don't take reputation as the good it brings, as that can encourage someone to emulate the perfectly unjust person he just described. Fair enough. At this point, Socrates says, okay, wonderful. You've set up such a great argument. Thank you for bringing me here and talking to me about this. I don't claim to be a very smart guy. So he says, trying to locate justice in an individual is like trying to read tiny letters that are very far away. Now, he says if the letters were much larger, it'd be a lot easier to distinguish their meaning. So instead of locating, defining, and defending justice in an individual person, he says, let's examine what it looks like in a city. This is an analogy that he makes throughout the work. Since if justice is a characteristic found in both an individual and in a community, there must be some common factor between the two, and that can lead us to better understand exactly what this elusive thing justice is. So in their description of a city, what follows is the discussion of the establishment of what starts as a fairly meager city and grows to a rather luxurious one. So Socrates says that people decide to live communally as opposed to just isolated on their own in order to better provide for their basic needs like food, shelter, and clothing. So it makes the most sense for farmers, carpenters, and tailors to establish a city together in which each performs only the art or the task that is the most appealing to them. So the smallest possible city, he says, that provides for the needs of its people only has to contain about 5 or 6 citizens, each performing a specific and vital task. However, through their discussion, the nature of the city changes substantially. They discuss adding more luxuries and surplus to the city and how that would change its population. Socrates says that they will want for more and new kinds of jobs must be filled, such as artisans, herdsmen, and specialized bakers to provide beautiful architecture, an array of meats, and baked delicacies, respectively. Further, the people of the city will want to trade, and that's going to require both merchants who are skilled in trading money and sailors who can transport the merchants and their goods back and forth. At this point, Socrates suggests, doesn't really argue this fully, this argument will be developed later on, but he argues that justice can only be located in some need that all of these people in the city have of each other. This is about as far as his definition goes at this point. So as their hypothetical city's needs and wants expand, so does the area of land that they will need to use. This implies the need of a military class, which Socrates takes as very serious business, since he believes each person should only do one kind of job that is in accord with their personal nature. So he argues that the nature of the military class must be of a special caliber. His description of the military class is really threefold. So first, a good soldier is like a puppy, agile, with good senses, and courageous. Second, they must have a proper balance of gentleness and spiritedness. Spiritedness is the translation used in the text. For Socrates and Plato, this corresponds to what we might think of today as an excitable, emotional nature. So the guardians must be both gentle with each other and the rest of the population, but quick to take up a noble fight should one arrive. And third, he believes that they must be philosophical, which for Plato and Socrates here means having a love of learning. For if a guardian's to be content to remain ignorant, he's going to have a hard time discerning the difference between friend and foe. So he concludes, the man who's going to be a fine and good guardian of the city for us will in his nature be philosophic, spirited, swift, and strong. Direct quote from the text here. So this really brings the discussion toward Plato's endorsement of censorship and monotheistic tendency, which requires that understanding of the importance of a guardian's nature. After having laid out the required temperament of a guardian, Socrates argues that a proper childhood education is essential to nurturing that temperament. To that end, he argues that there should only be certain approved stories about the gods that nurses and mothers are allowed to tell small children. Now, Adeimantus asks what those approved stories might look like, and Socrates begins with a series of questions. He asks if a benevolent being, particularly a god, harms anyone or brings about evil willingly, to which Adeimantus replies obviously no, for both. Then Socrates replies saying that stories about the god, in the singular at this point, should represent him as being the source of only good things in the world. This is contrasted with poems and mythology that present an extreme duality of Zeus particularly. There's a quote from the Iliad that Plato uses, and it goes, "Two jars stand on Zeus's threshold, full of dooms, the one of good, the other of wretched." as this is a quote from Homer's Iliad, we have to keep in mind that this is like a piece of history for the ancient Greeks that informed their understanding of both their civilization and the influence that the gods had upon them. So Socrates is in fact arguing here that contrary to traditional Greek education that shows the gods in their extreme ambivalence, especially guardians, as children, should only be told stories in which God is exclusively a benefactor. Another break from traditionally Greek stories is that Socrates argues stories in which people meet with tragedy should not be told, specifically good people. This is an important argument that he's going to pick up later in the Republic with regard to the very nature of artistic representation. But for now, as a matter of education, he believes children should only hear that people who meet tragic misfortune had some kind of punishment awaiting them as an effect of their ill deeds, so that if God allows a person to meet misfortune, it's because they had it coming. A final point to Socrates' argument about how gods should be represented has to do with their purity and how that is communicated in their representation. To take a quote from the text, he says, or really asks, are things that in the best condition least altered and moved by something else? For example, a body by food, drink, and labor, and all plants by the sun's heat, winds, and other affectations of the sort, aren't the healthiest and strongest, least altered. Hence, everything that's in fine condition admits least transformation by anything else. Okay, just to summarize, if anything is strong and good, it's not changed by external forces. Okay? So he then asks if God is great. Adeimantus replies, yes, of course. And if God is great, possibly the best thing, wouldn't transforming itself make it into something worse? And finally, if anyone or anything can voluntarily make themselves into something worse, would they? Which Adeimantus can't support. He says, of course not. No one's willingly making themselves worse. Therefore, it makes no sense that a god would willingly transform itself into something less magnificent than it already is. Further, this would make the gods inherently deceitful, which is a terrible thing for the youth to believe. Keep in mind, throughout a lot of Greek mythology, the gods present themselves in different ways. They take the form of animals, of mortals. They are quite deceitful. So Socrates argues that if a god is good, great even, they wouldn't make themselves into something worse, because nothing makes itself into something worse. And something that is good isn't going to willingly be deceitful either. So the book concludes with Socrates and his interlocutors agreeing that this course of action would be the best to educate the youth, particularly the guardians of their city. With that question of justice and whether or not is a good thing or what kind of good thing left unresolved for now. But we will pick that up later. Just to wrap up and summarize, in Book 2, we discuss several different things. The first one being the different kinds of good, what I call here intrinsic, total, and instrumental goods. There is that allegory, the Ring of Gyges, about Glaucon really trying to prove that if someone can get away with being evil, they will do it. The nature of reputation, whether that is why we act well in society, the establishment of a city, the necessity of a military, the kind of nature that military personnel should have, the raising of those military personnel, and how censorship and I guess a kind of monotheism factor into Plato's understanding of these stories that should be told to the youth. Anyway, thanks for joining me. Again, leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment. What do you think of the series so far? Would love to hear from you. And I will see you next time for Book 3. Later.